Hello and welcome to Virtually 2024, Nomensa's free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference. My name is Henry. I'll be your host for today. It's great to be back. And yeah, the next 3 days, we'll see 9 sessions from some of the leading thinkers in accessibility and inclusive design, share knowledge, best practice, and the latest thinking in this field. Whether you're a seasoned accessibility professional, a designer looking to bake more accessible practices into their work, or anyone else in between, it's great to have you with us. It's also fantastic to see signups from all over the world. We hope everyone who joins us finds the conference valuable and takes lots of knowledge back into their day-to-day roles. We are joined this week by MyClearText, who are providing live captions. You can access these by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of Zoom, or alternatively, we have provided a stream text link in the chat. All sessions will be recorded and available publicly online shortly after the conference ends. First up, we have Nomensa's Director of Accessibility, Alastair Campbell, with his talk, Beyond the Guidelines. In this talk, Alastair will discuss the limitations of the guidelines, and whilst they are a great baseline for accessibility, they do not cover everything. Alastair will speak on the reasons the guidelines do not cover everything, and they're good reasons too. When you understand the reasons behind this, you are able to make better decisions on when to test with the guidelines and when to do something else. Alastair will also look ahead to WCAG 3 and how future guidelines can expand their usefulness. As always, please do get involved in the chat and let us know where you're watching from. Just make sure your chat settings are turned to everyone and not panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see your messages. Also, please do submit your questions for Alastair using the Q&A box. I'll try and get through as many as I can with him at the end. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Alastair, to kick things off.
Thanks, Henry. And yeah, just to introduce myself, Director of Accessibility at Nomensa. I'm also co-chair and editor of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which I'm reasonably well known for, but today is kind of more with my other hat on. What do I do with our Nomensa's clients in terms of accessibility once we are going beyond the guidelines? So as Henry mentioned, we do consider the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as a baseline. I mean, it's quite a tough one. It can be tough to get to if you're kind of starting from scratch. But it is not everything in accessibility. There are things which get filtered out. There are tools other than guidelines, which should be used by many or kind of most organizations. And there are also things that are beyond the interface. So the guidelines are very interface focused. You know, what is this thing in front of you and how well does that work from an accessibility point of view? But those interfaces are generated by people, by organizations. So what else do we do on that organizational side as well? So to start off with, what don't the guidelines cover? Well, first thing to mention is the famous ones. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are one of 3 kind of in an ecosystem of accessibility. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are what you're looking at on a website. The user agent is what the end user has. It's usually a browser, but it can also include things like screen readers, magnifiers, voice input, switch inputs. There's lots of different ways people use to access websites and other technology. And they have a set of guidelines, not as well known because there's not as many people producing user agents. But it is important because those things have to work together. Slightly more common is the authoring tools accessibility guidelines, because the authoring tools are things like content management systems or even social media, you know, Twitter and Facebook and such. So those are another set of accessibility guidelines orientated towards those kind of tools. And these things should work together. But if you're just looking at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and you're using a content management system, then maybe something else to have a look at there. So when the guidelines are created, there's lots of sources of information. So there's kind of usability testing, surveys, research, and generally people's kind of lived experience. But those things are all brought together if you've got 100 people with disabilities, you're going to get 100 different stories on how a particular website worked. So it's trying to draw together the commonalities between those experiences and things that people creating websites and other technology can do in order to make it work better. But there is a filter. This is kind of the key bit I'm going to focus on. When these different experiences are sort of put into this melting pot of things that could become guidelines, there are filters on that process. So feasibility is quite a key one. There has to be something that people and organizations can do to kind of meet that requirement. So if all of these issues, we turn those into kind of requirements. So an issue might be, I can't read an image which doesn't have alt text. The requirement would be that images have alt text. So there has to be like a technique, a way of doing that in HTML and native mobile, etc. There are ways of doing that. So there are feasible techniques for giving alternative text to images. Something which goes into the web content accessibility guidelines has to apply across web technologies. So at the moment, that's HTML, CSS, etc. PDF and EPUB are mostly considered web technologies, depending on how you access them. It used to include things like Flash and Silverlight, but those have kind of fallen by the wayside now. It doesn't generally try to cover native mobile apps, although there is some work underway to sort of translate it for that purpose. But when I talk about sort of applying across technologies, that means it would need to apply across, HTML, PDF, EPUB in order to be included. If it only applied to one of those, it wouldn't be included. It's also another key filter is applies across all websites. So everything from big e-commerce sites up to kind of almost game sites, and then also including, personal blogs and, a massive range of websites. So if, you had something that only applies to very big websites, that couldn't really be included if it then made it impossible for small websites to meet the guidelines. And that is a kind of an impact of that we need to be very aware of. Does somebody deserve to be sued for not meeting a requirement? So if you think about, small business owners running an online shop, do they deserve to be sued about something? Now, if it's an actual accessibility barrier that people with disabilities will hit, then potentially yes, that's, the answer could be yes there. But if it's a guideline that sometimes increases accessibility, but doesn't always, so maybe there are, we've had some potential guidelines that we'd want to introduce for larger organizations, but then requiring that of smaller organizations, so inclusion of, say, usability testing as a requirement gets very tricky when you're talking about the range of potential organizations that we're supposed to be including. So any requirement we put in at the kind of A or AA level, so in web content accessibility guidelines, there are 3 levels, A, AA, AAA, and most of the regulations around the world have settled on kind of the AA level, so excluding AAA. So anything that goes in at that single or AA level does need to prevent or solve problems for people with disabilities. Some of the ones in the AAA level are either kind of less feasible or more situational. And actually, when we talk about going beyond the guidelines, I'm going to cheat slightly and say, go beyond the guidelines most people look at. Have a look at the AAA ones. So people don't generally look at these, partly because they're not always achievable or applicable, but they do give you a really good insight into ways to go above that baseline. We had a client not too long ago who we're doing a big kind of set of testing for. We were auditing this big 150-page application. We went through every page at the AA level. And they were asking, well, can we do AAA as well? And some of them are quite tricky to test. So there's lots of things around language, whether particular wording can be ambiguous and things like that. So it can be quite challenging, or time consuming at least, to test a large application or a large website for these AAA ones. But what we did was sit down and essentially we ran a little workshop. Once we'd done all this sort of testing, we had a really good knowledge of the site. We knew what's there. We knew what kind of issues it had at AA level. So one of the things we did was we ran this workshop to go through each of the AAA items and work out, do we want to test this in general? And some of those we did. For example, we could use the higher contrast threshold at AAA. So we were looking for sort of higher levels of contrast for the text and graphics. That was fairly straightforward to incorporate into the standard testing. But some of these we took as design inputs. So you've got visual presentation is one, where the presentation should be customizable. So that was a good one to test at the template level once rather than every page. We had other AAA guidelines that we incorporated into their style guide in terms of how things are worded. So we ran this workshop and we got some useful outputs from going through all the AAA guidelines, but not as an audit. This wasn't a standard audit. This was running through and feeding it into people's practices rather than just having a sort of tick box per page type of thing. So the next thing, where techniques are available. So techniques need to be available. And I've got a screenshot I took from Labyrinth, which is like an impossible building with, I think it's Sarah is the main character standing upright looking down. And we've got David Bowie's character standing underneath her, but looking up. Because it's one of those, I forgot the name of the artist, but the steps go in all different directions, the doors are in different directions. It's like gravity doesn't exist in this location in any kind of meaningful way. So I just picked that picture as an impossible thing to create. So there do need to be techniques available. So in the early days when we were doing website audits, quite a lot of our clients had maps, and they were really difficult things to make accessible. Really, the technology wasn't there. So there are sort of research experiments around sort of haptic maps and that kind of technology. But in reality, we were looking at needing alternatives. So instead of a map, you might have kind of directions. You could do certain things in terms of contrast, but by and large, if you can't use the map, you need some kind of alternative. One thing I would recommend, if you're hitting this kind of issue where there might be something that's a little bit kind of beyond the reach, have a look at what some of the kind of innovators in a space might be doing. So I've got a couple of things from the BBC. So for example, subtitle guidelines. If I was looking to do captions or subtitles, the guidelines say you must have them. Okay, it doesn't really go into a lot of detail about what should be in them. It does link off to some places, but essentially I would then start looking, if I was doing captions, particularly for television programs where it can be more involved than just what words are being said. I would look at the subtitle guidelines from the BBC. Also, if I was looking at typography, the BBC did a lot of research into accessible typography. They created their own font called, I think it's called Wreath. And there's a presentation from Gareth Edwards and his colleagues about the process they went through and the research they did to create that font. So you might not have the same kind of resources as those organizations, but maybe you can learn from what they have done. And similarly, Apple, that's a sort of make your own calm. That's a feature where it can, an Apple device can filter out background sounds. Not something you might be able to recreate, but it might be something you recommend your users try. And I've also got a picture of the Microsoft accessible game controller, which is sort of designed for people with mobility impairments, but creates a very adaptive interface. And again, you might not be able to recreate that kind of hardware, but is it something you can recommend to users? So whatever kind of space you're in, who are the accessibility leaders in that space? Who has done the research and is sharing it? Go and have a look. Another limitation on the guidelines is they have to be sort of context independent. And so that means, working across lots of different websites. The guidelines cannot kind of take into account the context of that particular website. What is that thing trying to do? And that has led to real difficulties with trying to incorporate a lot of cognitive barriers. So a few key things that I certainly came across when we were developing WCAG 2.1 and 2.2. So visual indicators of controls. So one of the key things is, can you tell what is interactive? And I've got a couple of examples that for most people are fine, but some people with cognitive impairments will really struggle because it is hard to tell what's interactive. So first example is the top of the Marks and Spencer's website, which has got a main navigation bar, and the context of that location is sort of telling me that must be navigation, even though the text links within it are plain text. There's no underline, there's no kind of special color. It's a very kind of black and white interface. So there's a little bit of context there that is enough for most people, but not for everyone. And similarly, underneath is an editing screen from, I think it was a WordPress, it's either WordPress or Squarespace. And it looks like the website, and there is nothing to indicate actually that you can click into it and start editing things. You get some mouse overs when you're trying to explore. But again, some people with cognitive impairments will really struggle because it's really hard to tell what's interactive and what isn't. So, but trying to create a guideline for this was really, really difficult. We did go down quite a long path of trying to do that, and failing to get agreement on what would pass or fail. So literally, we just had some examples. We had the guideline text, and we couldn't get agreement on what would pass or fail, no matter how much we refined that text. And that's partly because there's no kind of universal ways of saying this thing is interactive. There are indicators, but it varies so much depending on context. And if you try to apply basics like, all links must be blue and underlined, that actually makes things less usable in other ways. So it was a really difficult one to get to have a guideline that would make an improvement on the situation. So that was the first one. So using familiar design is another one. So using familiar concepts from that work on the platform, the web platform, is quite important. But again, there's so much variety on the web platform. What is familiar is very dependent on the person, apart from anything else. And also providing support for complex information. It was really difficult to structure a guideline that sort of required an abstract or an overview for complex content. When does that kick in? When should that apply? When shouldn't it apply? That was the main problem. So it's not that providing support for complex information is a bad idea. It's how do you define complex information? So that's all the difficulties we had in trying to incorporate, well, some of the difficulties we had in trying to incorporate these requirements. But there is COGA Usable, which is some supplemental guidance for WCAG. And it's really designed for making websites and applications more usable and accessible for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. And it's structured, it has user stories and objectives. So what is it that people are trying to achieve? It has a design guide. So it sort of flips that on its head and says, when you're designing things, here are things to try. It's got a section on sort of usability testing and research, and then the use cases and personas really backs up the objectives and user stories. So it has a set of personas, a person with a particular cognitive disability, and it runs through the kind of difficulties they have. It is a big document. I tend to use it as a reference point. So I would sort of dig in and go, so for somebody with memory issues, what kind of things do we need to worry about? Or on the design guide, what are the sort of heuristics I should be looking at when trying to do a design that doesn't overwhelm people? So if if you're going in for like a very data heavy thing, or a very content heavy website or a very interactive website, it's got design kind of principles in there that should help. And in general, for cognitive sort of accessibility, I do find that as a great way of making things easier for everyone, because you're designing almost like to an extreme, but when you design to that extreme, it helps everyone else as well. So one of the other kind of filters was technology. So there were some requirements that would be good for something like EPUB, but we couldn't include them because if you required it for EPUB and web, and they're both markup languages, it's really hard to separate them, then it could have had a negative impact on web accessibility. So that's one of the difficulties in EPUB in particular, because although it's using web technologies, it's XHTML, CSS, it's used in a different way. So you don't have the same kind of pages means a completely different thing. It's generally downloaded as a zip file or some kind of package and then displayed as a whole rather than having separate pages that you go through. So all the definitions didn't work basically. Yeah, sometimes things will get filtered out. So, and I was saying beyond the guidelines, beyond the web content accessibility guidelines, there are technology specific guidance. So for EPUB, for Android, iOS, for Microsoft 365, Acrobat tools, they all have their own guidance. You can usually just Google, say, Word accessibility, it'll get you to an overview page. And that's going to be much more specific and useful than the exercise of trying to translate the web content accessibility guidelines on your own, because they've already done it. Everyone's working to similar requirements. So do please, if you're using a different technology, go and find the guidance for that technology. And a similar theme, actually, if you're doing gaming, if you're creating games, then there is a game accessibility guidelines website that you can go to, because the WCAG wasn't really intended for that, but there are some much more specific ones. Anything actually that's very interactive, I would say have a look at the game accessibility guidelines. They're generally very helpful. Another aspect of WCAG is that the criteria are true-false statements. So everything is essentially true, false, pass, fail, which means that if you've got a sliding scale, so for example, your visual acuity is kind of a sliding scale from better than 20/20 through to low vision, can't be corrected by glasses, so that's essentially a continuum of vision. And there are other things which impact contrast, or ability to perceive contrast as well. But where we have things like contrast and size, the guidelines define this baseline, which means we kind of have to pick a particular point on that. Now, there is some research behind it, but at the end of the day, we're drawing a line in the sand to say, this is your minimum and it has to be that. So wherever that is the case, if it's specified in pixels or contrast ratio, go bigger. Generally go for more than the baseline. So I've got pictured a sort of small hit area and a large hit area. Assuming it's not going to overlap other things, go with the bigger hit area. Doesn't necessarily have to visually make the thing bigger, but you can give it sort of a slightly bigger invisible hit area. On the left is sort of the minimum text contrast. On the right, so that minimum is 4.5 to 1. On the right is 10 to 1. And it just pops out that little bit more easily. And similarly for things like focus styles. So when you've got, a 1 pixel line around a button, why not make that 2? You can use, focus appearance, so it doesn't appear when you click on things. So just make it really clear where people are as they're using the keyboard. So yeah, don't use the WCAG values as your maximum. They are the minimum. So those are the things kind of inherent to the guidelines. But again, those are all very interface specific things. There are other tools as well, and I would point to things like the inclusive design principles. This is really where you kind of take a step back from the interface. And it's much more useful kind of when you're planning to create things. So it's got principles, like aiming for a comparable experience, making sure that anything you're delivering, there is other ways to experience that as well. Making sure you're considering kind of unusual situations and edge cases. So particularly if you've got like an online offline journey, I find it very useful to kind of map the whole journey and then think through, what if I can't see? What if I can't hear? What if I've got a mobility issue? Or what if I've got a cognitive issue? How do those scenarios then impact that journey? Being consistent using well-established patterns. I talked about that a little bit in terms of cognitive, but it's generally helpful for everyone if you're using kind of well-established patterns rather than creating something completely new. And it's got things like not preventing user agents from customizing the interface, having different ways of doing things, prioritizing core content so that extraneous things don't sort of get in the way, and then adding to that experience where possible. So that could be, adding sort of dark mode or adding different ways of experiencing it yourself as on top of what the user agents can do themselves. So that's really good if you wanted to sort of take a step back and plan things more effectively. Another really key tool is usability testing. So, and this is great for understanding why people do what they do, and how people use things. And I always learn from when we do usability testing with people with disabilities. These are 2 questions that I have, and I always come away with new answers. We were doing usability testing a little while ago for a travel sector client, and I was learning, people with how people with deafness, people who are deaf, used airports where they can't hear the announcements. And one particular participant, she and her partner, both deaf, and one of them would have to constantly look at the screens to see if they had a different, if they needed to do, if there'd been a cancellation or if their gate was announced or moved, they had that constant visual vigilance, which I hadn't considered before. Now, doing usability testing, it's a fairly specialist discipline, and I wouldn't throw somebody into doing usability testing with people with disabilities to start with. I would, want them to get a bit of experience first. But then once you do have that experience, it's fairly easy to expand into testing with people with disabilities. There are whole training sessions and workshops on that, but it is something that I would want to incorporate. Now, it does depend on your budget, your size of organization, size of the project that you're working on. And I have this sort of general how to maximize your budget way of doing things. So if you have very minimal budget, I would typically go with something like a manual audit. You're going to learn lots about your interface, or you're going to sort of find that, technical basics and baseline issues that you want to make sure are solved. If you then have a little bit more budget and you can include standard usability testing, so that's sort of general public, not particularly trying to get people with disabilities, but that combination of an audit plus usability testing, I think is really sort of good value for coming up with an all-round better interface. And then if you have a bit more budget, I would probably go with manual testing, usability testing with people with disabilities, and depending on the scale of the website, maybe automated testing as well. That's the point at which I would throw in automated testing. And that's just my sort of feel for value for money, value for effort involved, and what you get out, how much better will the interface be given what you're putting in. So, and then at the top of this sort of diagram, I've got a program with everything. But that would also include things like, training and documentation and things. And usability testing isn't the only user research. Interviews, surveys, and kind of testing with mock-ups can and should all be done with people with disabilities. Some methods you might need to adjust. So if you've got kind of mock-ups, you might need to do kind of Wizard of Oz style testing, where you kind of pretend to be a screen reader for somebody who's using your mock-up. I've got on screen a poster from, I think it's from the Home Office originally, but it's part of the Government Digital Services, on what you can test with whom and when. And by the way, I'm going to drop some links to all of the sort of resources I've been covering at the end. But this is just really useful. James Buller came up with this whilst he was at the Home Office, and it's just a really useful kind of little metric to think through who you can include when, but also as a reminder to say we can and should be including people with disabilities in user research. If you're not doing any user research, sorry, this isn't going to give you the budget to do that. But if you are running user research, do consider this as you're going through. And also you can consider customer services or whatever equivalent you have in your organization as a good source of information. So if you go to that sort of department or people and say, have you had any queries from people with disabilities? What kind of issues have they hit? That can be a very good way of setting up a useful feedback loop. And then systematic design is one of the most important things I would sort of say can help you make things systematically accessible. Sounds straightforward when you say it like that, but so many organizations just don't have a systematic design approach. So every team does their own thing, creates their own components. They might have brand styles, but they don't really have either shared components or a shared understanding of what those components should be outputting. So I've got on screen, screenshots from the eBay Mind patterns from Government Digital Services. They create, these component libraries, which are really well documented as well. So it's going to tell you what the accessibility aspects of this component are, which is something you should then feed into things like acceptance criteria to say, yeah, there's, our accordion needs to have X, Y, and Z to make sure that it is accessible. And that solves so many problems before they happen. It's really important. Even better if you can set up kind of a useful feedback loop. So I've got a diagram on screen with kind of a project life cycle across the bottom, going from discovery to QA and launch. We've got our shared resources in the middle, so brand guidelines, design patterns, code libraries. And the idea here is that as you go through each project, you will hopefully use the code libraries and design patterns. And whenever you find holes or you find issues in them during that project, feed that information back into them so that the core resources get better. So next time somebody reaches for the dreaded carousel that's part of your code library, it's the best version that it can be. And you can also incorporate that into your sort of policies to say, this, our policy is that we do this. Another thing you can do is to take the information from the guidelines and then document how you do things. So there's pages and pages of information about heading structure and that sort of thing. But actually, if you just take into account your templates, your hopefully component library, and then just document how you do things, you can do that in so much less space. So you can make it so much easier because the guidelines are context independent. If you make it applicable to your context, it's so much easier to write and to understand. And that's something we did a project like that for the NHS, where we helped them sort of create the accessibility section of their service manual. And each, for each of the guidelines, there is a little section, but it's role specific. So it's, the designers only have to look at the design stuff. The developers look at the, the more technical things. And each section is so much shorter and easier to understand than the guidelines. And I'm not complaining about the guidelines. We do our best, but if you can put it in your own context, it's a lot easier. So the general things, and I would be a little bit remiss in a talk like this not to mention maturity models. And if you're not familiar, maturity models, it's a sort of general organizational thing where an organization on a particular topic, such as accessibility, may have done nothing about accessibility, in which case you might be at the sort of bottom of the maturity scale, usually called informal or initial or whatever. But basically, the organization as a whole has no awareness of this topic of accessibility. And then you start working up through, okay, so we define certain things. Once we've defined them, we make sure they're repeatable, managed and optimized as you kind of climb this scale of maturity. And there's different words for these things. And there are quite a few commercial accessibility maturity models from various organizations. I'm going to pick on the W3C one because it's not trying to sell its services as such. It's a sort of more agnostic accessibility maturity model. And generally this is to help you make the organization accessible rather than a particular interface. So, if you're looking at the organizational level, this is, the tool you want to start with essentially. And it can help to identify gaps between your current capabilities in accessibility and where you want to be. And it will give you essentially kind of next steps on how to improve your accessibility performance. So just on this kind of W3C one, the dimensions it uses are things like communications. So your internal, and external communications should be accessible. It's got knowledge and skills. How do you start and kind of promote the knowledge and skills within the organization? How do you support internal employees and external customers with disabilities? What are the accessibility considerations in the development lifecycle, development processes? When you're employing people, in terms of personnel, are the job descriptions accessible, and do they ask for accessibility when appropriate? How do you do recruitment? That sort of thing. Procurement's a really key one, finding and acquiring accessible products. And then culture, internal interactions, perception, and decision-making around accessibility. And then for each of those dimensions, there will be many kind of proof points. So these are things that you could sort of point to and say, yep, we've done that, that's accessible. So, and just each of these is like one example from many within that document. But for communications, do you have accessible corporate document templates? That's something we have to work on a lot at Mensa. Knowledge and skills, are the accessibility criteria integrated into performance measurements? There's other things around training, but then once you've had training, are people kind of essentially measured on their accessible output? Do you have a written policy on requesting and providing employee accommodations? Do your design guides include accessibility considerations? Do your hiring announcements have kind of diversity statements? And, are accessibility requirements communicated to vendors for procurement? So there's lots of these kind of different points you can apply to the organizational level. And if you're relatively lowly designer or developer, this might not be something you can action, but it is certainly something to try and communicate up the chain. And the other thing I would do, want to do sort of organizationally, is make sure it's not down to one or two people. So champions networks are fairly typical for larger organizations when they're putting an accessibility program in place and trying to keep that momentum going, because it's more than one person. And generally you're going to want people from different, I put tracks, I'm not sure why I put tracks, I thought I'd change that to teams, but people from different teams, you want different roles who are part of this kind of champions network. So within each team, you've got somebody who is the go-to person for accessibility. They might not be experts, but they have an interest. You've got meetings, say monthly, around what you can do to update your resources and things. And you do generally need a senior sponsor, otherwise it tends to sort of collapse under lack of momentum. But if you've got a senior sponsor who's saying, yes, this is the thing we're doing, and we're going to put targets in place, it starts to build up a bit of momentum. So you might think I have been a little bit down on the guidelines. Well, we do know about the sort of issues that I've been talking through, and to a certain extent, I think WCAG 2 has only been as successful as it has because of the structure it was given and the kind of discipline. I wasn't involved when WCAG 2 came out, but there was a real discipline in terms of what could be included, and that really helped it become useful for people in the sort of regulatory field, in the legal field. And if it hadn't done that, it wouldn't be as well known as it is now. But there are things in WCAG 3, which is still early days at the moment, that we are trying to improve in that. So WCAG 3 is a slight adjustment. It's not the web content accessibility guidelines anymore. It's the W3C accessibility guidelines with a silent 3. And it came out of a kind of project codename Silver, just because AG, Accessibility Guidelines AG, is the chemical symbol for silver. And that has now become the main focus of the working group. So we're still updating the documentation for WCAG 2.2, but we're not intending to do a 2.3. So the next one will be 3. And well, we've been working through the limitations. Other things which I haven't mentioned as much were, because the scope of testing in WCAG 2 is limited to page, that has made it harder to sort of incorporate single page web apps and other technologies. So we're going to try and adjust that. We want to introduce a mechanism so you might have differences in context. So something might apply in Hebrew that doesn't apply in English, or vice versa. The backwards compatibility should be a little bit more flexible than we've had in WCAG 2, because we can't effectively remove things from WCAG 2 at the moment. And we're trying to introduce more ways of testing things than just true-false statements. Some things might be sort of on a scale or have a little bit of flexibility in terms of how they're tested. I would just put in a note of caution, because we're in an almost infinitely sort of infinite medium, because websites can be put together in a massive array of different ways, and people and their user agents, their browsers, their assistive technology can interpret that content in a myriad of different ways. It is a very difficult environment in which to create rules. But for WCAG 3, yeah, we are looking to update the guidelines to incorporate a bit more sort of cognitive accessibility. We also want to adjust how accessibility support works in WCAG 2, which that's a little bit in depth, but basically make it easier for people to know when you're testing something, whether that's going to work across different assistive technologies. And hopefully update it more often as well. In terms of timeline, it's been going for a while. So we're about 8 years in at this stage. It's kind of been a slightly back burner project for most of that, but it started off with a lot of research into how it should be structured and designed and what the requirements were. We have had a first public working draft. We've more or less completely overhauled it after some feedback, and we're coming out with new drafts. And actually, if you check in a couple of days, you might find there is an update which has got a whole host of our reformulated guidelines. That should be this week, but please don't spread that around too much. And we are looking for feedback. So once it does come out, you'll be able to find the draft at the editor's draft bit. And issues are the best way of, or sort of raising issues is the best way of sort of communicating back to the working group, because we will work through an issue and hopefully feedback to whoever raised that issue about what the outcome of it will be. And hopefully that has been a good roundup. And Henry, any questions?
Thank you, Alastair. Excuse me. What a great talk. Yeah, super useful too. With lots of great resources in there as well. As you said, we will be sharing them, I think, in the chat. And we can also email them out to everyone as well. If anyone does have any questions for Alastair, please do submit them now. Please use the Q&A boxes. There has been lots of messages in the chat, and I don't want to miss anything. So Alastair, I mean, I was going to ask you a question on the complexity and time it takes to kind of produce the guidelines, but you covered that in your last few slides. I think 8 years is kind of a long time. How much of a kind of spanner in the works do things like emerging tech throw in, and when you're kind of writing the guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, you could consider it as a never-ending thing that we're having to take into account things like VR and more kind of spatial technologies now, which brings a whole load of new things. But it's quite difficult to do in the WCAG 2 structure. We're hoping in the WCAG, what we're trying to do in WCAG 3 is make the structure more flexible to that. So it starts with kind of outcomes. So an outcome might be essentially, as a user, I can get a text alternative. It doesn't specify how. And then we have another level underneath that, which will say how for HTML, EPUB, VR, native mobile app. So we're trying to make the outcomes very generalized. So they should last because they're based on human requirements.
Yeah.
But then the technology bit underneath that can be more changeable.
Okay, brilliant. That's really interesting. So we've got a few questions. So first one from Damien. Damien asks, what about going kind of too much above the baseline in the guidelines? Kind of will WCAG include guidance on using kind of too high a color contrast? For example, is there any kind of guidance or advice on that?
I think if you start going too far, you're going to notice obvious usability issues. So yeah, you can have things like if there is no area of the screen which isn't a target, that can make it hard to scroll or like just do other things. If you've got too much contrast, that is, I would say, a lesser problem than not enough contrast. There are some people who struggle with too much contrast. But the kind of get out clause on that is that if people have tools to override the color scheme, you should make sure those work. So things like light mode, dark mode, high contrast mode. If something like high contrast mode works properly, a low contrast mode will also work because you've kind of made sure that the colors are customizable. There are just little things like if you use something like a box shadow for a focus style, that can disappear in high contrast mode. But if you're design and approach is flexible to and allows people to override the color schemes, that's the best thing. And in WCAG 3, we're going to try and structure it that way so that, you know, if the baseline there is more sort of things like let the user do what they need to do, and then once that's done, yes, try and meet these kind of design criteria. But yeah, there'll be a little bit of structure to that.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm just having a little look in the chat just for a few more questions. So we've got a question from Hadley here, Alastair. I mean, it's, you know, you kind of briefly touched on accessibility champions. And Hadley is just kind of asking if anyone has you know, any experience of setting up kind of accessibility champions. And, you know, if there's any advice kind of you may have for kind of, you know, creating positive energy towards it kind of accessibility kind of within an organization.
Possibly asking like the accessibility curmudgeon how to create a positive vibe. But I would probably point you towards people like Heather Hepburn at Skyscanner, who I'm fairly sure has done talks on this topic. And she has, and I know several of our clients have. And in terms of sort of positive energy, I think that's mostly to do with kind of how you set it up. Always in accessibility, there's an old phrase from somebody called John Folliott, which is be the fireman, not the policeman. So the fireman, everyone is happy to see because they're helping you to solve a problem, which is your house is on fire and you want help. And this fireman turns up, great. When the policeman turns up, people get nervous. Even if they're there to help, you tend to get nervous when the policeman turns up. So don't make accessibility into a you must conform and you're going to get sued if you don't do it. No, you start off on the foot of we want to make this for everyone, or we want you to be able to do a professional job, because doing accessibility is part of doing a professional job. That's actually my number one kind of almost like positive reinforcement when I'm doing training and things. It's that, you know, you should have been doing this, but admittedly, you know, accessibility isn't built into the educational routes that designers and developers and people go through. So it's really understandable. People don't know much about accessibility. That's fine, but it is part of doing a professional job. So there's various positive buttons that you can try pressing. But in terms of setting it up, yeah, try and find one of those sort of or a positive set of reasons for doing it. Get your senior stakeholder involved, and when you're doing that, you can use the more negative, you know, legal reasons, we might get sued kind of reasons, to get it set up. But when you're talking to people who are doing it as part of their day job, or should be doing it as part of their day job, definitely go with the sort of more positive reasons than the stick reasons. It's kind of from product managers and above that you want to use the more negative reasons.
Brilliant, thank you. Be the fireman, not the policeman. I love that. And yeah, Hadley, I also believe I think it was either last year or the year before. There's a great talk from a previous virtually from Heather Hepburn, kind of all about champions. That's on the No Mensa YouTube channel. So please do check that out. So yeah, I think that's all the questions for this session. Alastair, thank you so much. That was such a great talk. We will be sharing the recording as soon as that is ready. So please do keep an eye on your emails for that. Thank you to everyone that joined us. Up next, we have Catherine Weston from the RNLI. And Catherine is going to be talking about the RNLI's accessibility journey, and that is at 1 p.m. UK time. We hope to see you all back there for then. And yeah, thanks again.